Welcome to episode 28 of a successful demo. In each episode, we analyze the theoretical and practical aspects of our newly released cards. Today, we'll be looking at Joule. First and foremost, I did some cursory research on this, but it fell short. So, if any of you viewers can help me out with this, that would be really good. What on earth is a Joule? And what is this card art? And what significance does Joule have in the context of the Kitara cycle? All these thematic questions I don't have answers to, so if you can enlighten me on this, much appreciated. Anyway, we'll talk about the mechanics of it. There are quite a few components to cover. I'll start by talking about the on-encounter ability, followed by its subroutine text itself. Finally, I'll be looking at the card as a whole, its statistics and its typing, and we'll make a judgment on it. So, let's begin with the on-encounter ability. As with most ambient ice, this one does have it. When the runner encounters Joule, he or she cannot install cards for the remainder of the turn. Now, even though this covers installs for the remainder of the turn, what this truly excels at, its main use, I would argue, is to disable cards that install cards with a paid ability window. You know, something like your self-modifying code, your clone chip, and conspiracy breakers. These have been dominating the competitive meta in ever since they were printed, to be honest, simply because one of the most powerful aspects of ice is that they can inflict a lot of damages to the runner if they face check an ice without the proper breaker out. Cards like SMC, Clone Chip, and Conspiracy Breakers get around this because you do not need to pre-install all your breakers to safely run. If you encounter an ice type you cannot break, well, we'll just bring out the correct breaker. Thus avoiding these nasty subroutines. So this is why runners have been very strong, and Joule is one way in which we can temper that strength, because this is very powerful against especially Anarchs, because if you imagine, for example, you have a simple server comprising of Joule on the outside and Vanilla on the inside. The Anarch player has a paperclip in their bin, but no breakers installed. When they hit the Joule, they are not able to install paperclip for the rest of the run. When they go into the Vanilla, they won't be able to install the paperclip from their bin, so they can't get through the server. And even in subsequent turns, they won't be able to fetch said paperclip from the bin because they need to encounter the Vanilla first in order to get the paperclip out, which they can't without passing through the Joule and eating the on-encounter effect. So this is a very powerful mechanic just because it's an on-encounter effect. Even if, say, the Anarch player installs an MK Ultra to break the Joule, they still have to suffer the on-encounter effect and they won't be able to get the paperclip off their bin. This is why this is most powerful against Anarchs, and given that Anarchs are pretty prevalent now, I think we'll see a fair bit of Joule as a meta call. So there is a nuance to this though. I've been talking about Anarchs, but against Shapers this might not be so good. This is because the runner has a window to pop their SMC or clone chip before the Joule on-encounter effect fires. And to clarify this, we can look at the timing structure of a run. At stage 2.3, when Joule is rezzed, the runner has a paid ability window in which they can pop their SMC or clone chip before they reach stage 3 of the timing structure of the run, where Joule's on-encounter effect fires. This means that they can potentially get the correct breaker out. If you remember the Joule into Vanilla example, Shapers can potentially get their Inti or their whatever fractal they're running, Cerberus Lady, Inti, or even Paperclip out with SMC before the Joule on-encounter effect fires, so they can still break the innermost Vanilla. So this is not that good against Shapers. However, it still helps against Shapers, don't get me wrong, because if your innermost ice is unres, if it's a Joule into an unknown ice, the runner potentially has to make a guessing game for the runner. They have to guess what the innermost ice is and bring out the correct breaker with SMC and clone chip beforehand without knowing what the ice is. So it has an edge against Shapers, but where it truly shines is against Anarch. Now let's move on to the subroutine. If you fail to break Joule, what happens? Well, the corp is able to choose 2 installed runner cards, and the runner must add one of those chosen cards to the top of the stack. So first thing we notice is that this does not end the run. Therefore, maybe it's not a gear check ice? Well, I argue not. I think this is just as much of a gear check ice as, say, Sapper or Snake in Cobra, because it interferes with already installed breakers. Joule allows you to essentially trash a program. It's a very similar subroutine, except that instead of putting your opponent's program into the bin, you put it onto the top of that stack, and that comes with some hidden benefits. Firstly, you are immune to sacrificial construct. SACCON cannot prevent the effect of adding a program to the top of your stack, whereas they can prevent the trash a program. So it's already better than that. And to make things better for Joule, this synergizes very well with the on and counter effect, because this means that you are basically kind of immune to heap breakers, honestly. The problem with trash a program in today's context is that even if you trash your opponent's paperclip, for example, when they encounter the innermost vanilla, they can still get the paperclip back, which is why you see that rush strategies like, playing a sentry in front of a barrier like Sapper into vanilla, for example, is not that good, because Anarchs can simply get the paperclip from their bin to get past the vanilla without much recourse. Joule is different. If I put your paperclip on your stack, you're not getting into the vanilla, because it's the paperclip's not in your bin, it's on your stack where it cannot be installed. So Joule it really shines in that regard, and because of this, it is most effective as a non-innermost ice, just as with program trashers and destroyers. You want Joule to be on the outside and your end run like vanilla to be on the inside. Now, looking at Joule as a whole, it actually has really good stats. One big problem with a lot of other similar janky ice is that their stats are just terrible, which means that they won't see competitive play even though they might have some niche use. For Joule, it has pretty good numbers, right? 2 res cost is amazing for a sentry. If you think of guard, for example, as a sentry gear check, it's 4 to res for a guard. Joule costing 2 is a huge deal, because this means that you can push out your agendas that much more quickly. It also has a very good typing in the sentry, because typically most gear check ice and the run ice tend to be code gates and barriers. Sentries, not so much. As I mentioned, most of the sentry gear check ice are destroyers, which are not that effective against Anarchs, but Joule, really good. It's a sentry, which means that it forces the extra breaker out against most runners. Always a good thing. And finally, it's 2 influence. This is a very important point, because as an NBN ice, NBN isn't exactly the rush faction nowadays. So we'll almost certainly be importing Joule into one of the other factions. And because of this, the 2 influence means that we can actually afford 2 or 3 copies of Joule. All in all, I think Joule is a pretty fine ice for rushing behind, so we're going to build a rush-based deck. Today we'll be building it out of Pilana Foods. Pilana is a very good rush ID because it generates the early economy you need to get going to score your early agendas. So it's a very reliable economy engine nowadays, because runners like to draw cards a lot. And honestly, Jinteki has some of the best agendas and ice in the game, so that lends itself very well to a rush strategy. You can see on the screen some of my reasonings for the rest of the cards in my deck. I'm just going to point a couple of them out. For the ice that you see, there's a pretty good mix of barrier, sentry, code gate, and also the 4th subtype. The Excalibur forces the AI breaker out if you have a Nisei Mark II token, which is extremely good, and a reason why we are playing this in Jinteki instead of, say, Wayland. Even though Wayland might seem like a good rush faction, they're not that prime. They are not in a prime position to take advantage of the Mythic Ice, whereas in Jinteki it's a no-brainer. Nisei Mark II Excalibur is a very powerful combo that can easily punish a runner without an AI breaker. You also have good defensive strategies. Your Obokatas protect themselves, Future Perfect protects itself, and Mirage protects you from indexings and runner cards that peek at the top of your deck. You'll notice that we are playing some heavy-duty ice as well in the Chiyashi and the DNA Tracker. Even though this is a rush deck, we need the threat of such big and painful face check ice. Firstly, because we don't want to lose to runners being aggressive on centrals. Typically in a rush deck, you dedicate a lot of ice to your remote, which leaves you vulnerable on centrals. Chiyashi and DNA Tracker allow you for a single click to install these very painful ice, and they will basically protect that server for most of the early to mid game, which is very important. So yeah, that's this deck in general. We are going to give this a test run. Let's see if we can rush out under the Joule. Today we are up against Valencia with a mighty fine opening hand. Two big economy cards in the Celeb Gift and IPO that can be played back to back. Well, I'm not going to be too greedy with that. I'm going to actually install one of my ice instead of playing the IPO here, simply because we have to respect, indexing out of Valencia, for example. So on to R&D, my fetch out 2 goes, and my opponent immediately goes to town on my on my HQ. There are some very easily trashable cards in there, but what really makes this worth it is the more... Oh gosh, it hit my IPO. That's the worst. That was a very good opening from my opponent. They started with Sure Gamble, which put them to 9 credits, and thus they were able to justify playing the Maw so early on. Hitting the IPO was a big boon for my opponent because that would have given me enough money to deal with the rest of the game otherwise. Now, I had 2 options at this point in time. Option 1 was to put the DNA tracker on HQ. My opponent didn't know that there's a DNA tracker coming up. I showed them my entire opening hand with Celeb Gift, but they did not see the DNA tracker I just drew. That would have been a very good way to induce them into running HQ and eating up a DNA tracker. I did not go with that play because I wanted to get the NGO off. My reasoning was that if I res the DNA tracker on HQ, I'll be dirt poor, and that doesn't lend itself very well to rushing out against this Valencia deck, which is pretty good late game. So I went with the, I went with, I'm just going to concede my HQ. I'm going to have no cards in my hand for the rest of the game, but I drew into a Chiashi, which is a nice ice to put on HQ, I guess. Better than letting my opponent maw it for sure. Now, you notice there, I made an interesting play. I res the NGO before I actually passed the turn over to my opponent, because there was no reason not to do so. Firstly, my opponent knew that was an NGO 100% because they saw the Celebrity Gift, so they knew that was the only advanceable card in my hand. Secondly, I did not want to die to something cheesy like Interdiction or Hacktivist Meeting. So that's why I pre-res the NGO. I immediately popped it because I drew into my Nisei Mark II, which I immediately scored the next turn, and this puts me at a very strong advantage. What this deck really wants to do, something I neglected to mention earlier on, is that you need to rush out the early Nisei no matter who you're up against. And today, that against Val, you really want to get it out before they get the breaker set up, which is what I did here. So that's very good for a multitude of reasons. Thankfully, the Maw trigger on R&D here hit the Agroplex instead of the Future Perfect. I wouldn't really appreciate having 3 agenda points in the bin. So here I draw into Ginger Grid. So I have a Ginger Grid in hand, I have a Future Perfect in hand. This is very awkward. Why don't I just install both of them to play around Maw? Maw is so annoying. And yeah, if I can blank Maw by leaving myself with no cards in hand, sure, why not? Just hope I don't draw into any other agendas anytime soon. This Future Perfect is going to take quite a bit of effort to score. Because it's a Ginger Grid and not something like a Marcus Batty, I cannot guarantee that advancing it twice this turn will allow me to score it next turn because they have their breakers and everything. There's a Black Orchestra in the bin, as you can see. My opponent plays a system outage here and I had to give it a read because this is the one current Rush Corps don't want you to know about. Clickbait title for this video. Yes, this is not a universally good current by any means, this system outage, but against a Rush deck like mine, this hurts for 2 very big reasons. Firstly, you see the card in my hand. I just drew a Celeb Gift. The natural thing to do, disregarding the current, would be to draw up 3 times so that I can play the Celeb Gift on a future turn. I can't do that. If I draw up 3 times, I'll lose 3 credits, and that completely negates the Celeb Gift advantage I would have anyway. The second reason I do not want to do that is because why this current sucks so bad is because I need to draw up into more ice. Because I have Ginger Grid on the remote, I need more ice on the remote to buff up my Seder Adaptive Barrier and to hopefully find more gear check on the remote. Well, I can't do that either, so I'm basically stuck with clicking for credits this turn. I can't advance my ice because the remote's too flimsy. I can't draw cards, so I can only click for credits. My opponent runs HQ here and I did not res the Chiashi even though I could, for a simple reason. If I res the Chiashi here, my opponent would simply run the remote and steal my Future Perfect. Bad idea. So I'm just going to continue clicking for credits up to a point where I can afford to res this Chiashi in their face, like I'm doing here. This wouldn't kill them because they have a Caldera out, but still it's going to be a nice tempo hit against them, and more importantly, it protects this Obo Carter in my hand. A very dangerous agenda, can't let them have it. You note that even though they won't be able to steal the Obo Carter if I let them into HQ, they could maul it into a bin and steal it on a later run. So we cannot let that happen. Obo Carter has to stay in hand, make it harder for them to access it. So this is where I need the strong eyes on HQ in the Chiashi. I draw into a Mirage here and I decide to install it on the remote simply as Seder Adaptive Barrier fodder. I'll continue advancing this ice on the remote. Advancing this agenda in the remote, trying to get this future perfect out. I know that they don't have a paperclip in the bin, so this should be a good time to get the Seder barrier out to stop them from contesting a remote. And this is really what you want to do against Valencia. Late game, they have a lot of money. This guy's on data folding, so you bet that they will be swimming in credits late game, and I can't lock them out of the remote. I need to gear check them before they find their breakers. A 50 card deck, that's the downside that you have to exploit. So this Seder barrier here just says, nope, you're not coming in, nope. And my opponent just continues on their merry way, injecting into a bunch of stuff and carrying on. So I'm going to get this future perfect out, which is really cool. Getting up to 5 points is always a big deal as they start pitching a paperclip into the bin, something I definitely am taking note of. And the future perfect scored, but most importantly, system outage is gone. I don't have to worry about that stupid current. Knife is played on HQ. Do I use the Nisei token here? I just immediately trashed my Chiashi without thinking about that decision. But my opponent allowed me to take it back if I wanted to. I decided not to. Now, while having a Chiashi on HQ seems very important when you have two freaking agendas in hand, my reasoning was this. I badly needed the Nisei token to win the game, right? Because if I don't have a Nisei token, I can't stop my opponent from getting through the Seder barrier and the DNA tracker on my remote. There's just no way. My opponent has the breakers at this point, so I need the taxation offered by the Nisei token. I don't need to protect my HQ at this point. So I got very lucky on that turn there because they ran HQ, stole one Obo Carter, and then ran again for the Maw trigger, but missed the second Obo Carter with the Maw trigger. If the Maw trigger hit the Obo Carter and placed it in the bin, I would have been in a lot of trouble. However, this mandatory draw here doesn't help me at all. I have two agendas in my hand and I can only afford to put one of them in the remote. I can't even score the agenda. So I have two options here. I could install and advance the Nisei token, the Nisei Mark II, and take a credit, forcing the game next turn. The problem with that play is I think my opponent could very easily siege my remote next turn. They could run the remote. I cannot afford to rest any other ice on the remote because I won't be able to score the Nisei otherwise. They could just run the remote twice because they have more than enough money to do so. So the correct answer here, I believe, was to actually feign the second Nisei by advancing the Obo Carter instead. My hope here is that my opponent would be tempted to run early on in the turn, which is exactly what they do here. On their third click, they run with only 3 cards in hand. If the single advance agenda in the remote had been a Nisei, they could easily steal it because they would run twice and, force the Nisei token on the first run and steal the Nisei on the second time. Instead, since this is an Obo Carter and they were forced to run early with only 3 cards in hand, I knew they couldn't steal the Obo Carter. So I'm not going to use the Nisei token here. I'm going to let them access the Obo Carter, which they can do nothing about. They'll get a Maw trigger. The Nisei Mark II goes in the bin, the actual Nisei Mark II, while I slowly advance this Obo Carter for my victory. So I'm definitely going to advance the Obo Carter here, and obviously I take a bunch of credits, shuddering in my seat as I draw yet another freaking agenda. Oh my gosh, how did I draw so many agendas all at once? This is really unlucky. So knowing that I was going to threaten the game win, my opponent obviously had to run my remote here. They got the Film Critic out, and I'm going to fire a Mirage here. Notice that I'm too poor to rest the innermost DNA tracker, so that's a dead piece of ice right there. Firing the Mirage was interesting because the Mirage draw gave me an ice that I could put on my remote, increasing the taxation power of Seder Adaptive Barrier by 1 due to raising its strength. Then I'm going to end the run here with the Nisei Mark II token, forcing them to make a final run with much fewer credits than they can afford the run. Or can they? They can afford the run! Damn it! The bad publicity got them just enough credits. As I looked, I realized that there was nothing I could do about this. I had to hope that the Mirage draw would give me yet another ice, because if I got another piece of ice on the remote, Seder Adaptive Barrier will go up to 7 strength. They need 6 credits to break that Seder, they would be 1 short. Oh man. But I have another option, because the outermost ice, the one that I just installed with the Mirage, is a Joule. We both knew it, and so I had two options here. If I did not rest the Joule, I would be basically gambling on the Mirage draw. If I don't draw an ice, I essentially lose the game because I have a bunch of agendas in archives. Or I could drag out the game by resing the Joule here. What does Joule do? Well, firstly, it would prevent them from installing any further breakers. But most importantly, they will fail the gear check because they don't have MK Ultra in the bin, which will allow me to start bouncing cards from their board. So if I started considering here, if I picked Paperclip and Film Critic, they would either have to put the Paperclip or the Film Critic onto their stack. Either way, they will not be able to steal this Obocarter in the remote. So that's exactly what I did. I'm gonna let them choose between their breaker and their Obocarter stealer in the Film Critic, because without Film Critic, they cannot steal the Obocarter inside. They are one card short once again. Again, this is a rush deck. You play this so fast that your opponent doesn't have time to draw up. So the Joule here is gonna threaten them. They have to decide between the Film Critic and the Paperclip. Which one do they want to keep? Which one do they want to return to the top of their stack? Either way, they won't be able to make it through the remote this turn, but I won't be able to score either. I'm super poor. I'm down to 1 credit, which means I have to wait another turn to score out. One thing to note is that the Philotic Entanglement I drew earlier is back in my deck because I shuffled in back into my deck with Mirage. Alright, so my opponent goes once again. They put the Film Critic onto the top of their stack, which they then drew, installed again this turn, and allows them to run. Okay, my English is terrible. The Joule trigger last turn, put Film Critic to the top of the stack, but this turn they simply drew the Film Critic, installed it, and made a run on the remote. And this time they do have enough credits to get through the remote. They have 6 credits, meaning that even if Mirage draws me an ice, I won't be able to keep them out. So I'm gonna do the same Joule routine again, except that this time it's worse because now they actually have 4 cards in hand. If they put the Film Critic to the top of their stack, they can still steal the Obocarter. So Mirage fires here, I draw a card. It is an Enigma. Obviously I put it on the remote, but that's too little too late. My opponent is now that much richer thanks to the data foldings. They can now exactly afford the 7 strength Satyr Adaptive Barrier, exactly afford the 4 net damage to steal the Obocarter, and even triggers an iFight. Worse, putting them in a very sweet spot where all they have to do is to run archives and win. I draw into a Chiyashi here, which I immediately put on my remote. I don't have the money to res it, it's just going to be Satyr fodder. So again, my opponent wins if they run archives here. They don't know it, of course. I've been drawing a bunch of genders, but that's what it is. This is a terrible position for me, and I'm struggling to think of what my outs are at this point. But thankfully, my opponent doesn't run archives. I draw into a Satyr barrier here, and I'm like, well, if I want to win this game, I need to ice archives, right? Because if I threaten an agenda in the remote, they can simply run archives on a Hail Mary and win the game. So I definitely needed to ice archives there, which is why I put the Satyr there. And I'll continue fortifying archives because there's no way I can get rid of the Nisei, the game-winning Nisei for my opponent that is now in the bin. System outage comes out, but that's pretty irrelevant by this point. I draw yet another ice in the Cobra. So okay, I draw into the perfect agenda, Philotic Entanglement. Now this makes things interesting. The 1 of 3/2 agenda in my deck now threatens the game win. This is the perfect agenda because my opponent cannot this doesn't telegraph an agenda. They have to respect that it could be a Philotic, but it could easily also be a Marcus Batty or some other bait. So because of this, they went for the surefire play, the most consistent play in installing Equivocation and running R&D a bunch of times, which I can respect. That seems like a really good decision. The funny thing this does is that the Equivocation system outage combo actually drains my credits, although that's pretty irrelevant by this point. So yeah, I'm getting poorer and poorer here as they start draining my credits, but what they really want here is the multi-access on R&D. This is basically a souped up Maker's Eye. By running multiple times, they're going to access 3 or 4 cards off the top of R&D between Equivocation and actual accesses, but they do not find the agenda. By this point, my deck was stacked against my opponent. 3 of my 8 agendas were already in the score area. 1 of the Niseis is in the bin, and the winning agenda was in the remote, meaning that there were only 3 agendas remaining in R&D of 21 cards, of which one of them is in Obocarter that they cannot afford to steal and win on their final 2 clicks. Against all odds, I managed to pull out a victory despite being crazy agenda flooded at one point during the game. Now, there was a lot going on in that final turn for my opponent, so much so that I didn't have the time to break down all the possible options my opponent had. As you could see, they went for the R&D option. After doing some calculations, it turns out that they actually had a roughly 40% chance to win, given the line of play they took. Instead, there was some better and some worse options. If they had went for archives instead, perhaps, just a single archives run after taking 3 credits, or perhaps switching to archives on the last click instead of going for another equivocation run, my opponent would actually have better odds, simply because there was a game-winning agenda in archives. It cost them 7 credits to break through the archives because that server was Cobra or Snake into say the adaptive barrier. Now they can completely ignore Snake because they are anarchs after all, which means that they can allow the Snake to trash a paperclip. It's fine because when they meet the Seder barrier, they can simply reinstall the trash paperclip back on the board and break it as usual. So the cost of installing the paperclip from the bin and then breaking it with paperclip, that would be 7 credits. However, they do have a bad pub, so had they gone for this line of play after clicking for credits, they would have definitely won. Had they ran archives on the final click with equivocation, they may have slowed me down a bit, but I think I still would have won. They would have forced me to use a lot of credits, but that wouldn't be enough because I only needed 3 credits to score the Philotic. So yeah, basically that only out there was to take 3 credits and run archives, but that was a very difficult call to make because number 1, they didn't know what my archives eyes were, and 2, they didn't know if I was using them. There may not even be an agenda in there in the first place. So very difficult call for my opponent to make, which is why I respect that they went for the consistent option. Consistent in the sense that no matter what they did, they always stood, they had a baseline chance of 30 to 40% to win regardless. Now, the remote was completely out of the option for them. I think this was pretty obvious, but especially after all the ice being revealed by Ginger Grid, they did see an Enigma go on the Ginger Grid remote. So there was no way they were going to get through without something like a stim hack because they didn't have Black Orchestra installed. That would have taken way too much money to install and break Enigma with. So yeah, I think my opponent played pretty well. It's just that I just completely lucked into the one-off Philotic Entanglement in my deck. After shuffling it in with Mirage, I managed to find it in quick time, put it in a remote, and yeah, the rest was history. Now, this was a successful demo of Joule. Was it? I don't think so. I don't think so at all. Look at the Obokata that I slammed into the remote at one point. My opponent was able to get in, steal the Obokata, despite not having their MK Ultra out for the entire game. How is that possible? Joule didn't do its job. It was supposed to gear check the Sentry Breaker. That didn't happen. Why was that? Let's delve in and analyze this. This was the board state when the Obokata was jammed in. They met the Joule on the outside, which was supposed to have gear checked the Sentry, meaning that if they don't have a Sentry Breaker, they cannot get this agenda, period. But that wasn't the case because Joule's subroutine allows the runner to choose 1. I choose 2, but they get to choose the 1. So, of course, I'm going to choose the paperclip, but even that doesn't matter because I have to choose the paperclip with another card that my opponent has installed. No matter which card I chose, they were simply going to choose the other card to put back to their stack, meaning that they would never be gear checked on the Seder barrier because they would always have their paperclip out. And this is the fundamental issue with Joule. In this particular example, I was lucky. I was put in a situation where I was able to double gear check my opponent. They needed 2 pieces of gear to steal the agenda. They needed the paperclip to get past my barrier, but they also needed the Film Critic to steal the Obokata. You notice they have only 3 cards in hand. So Joule is good at double gear checking in the sense that if the runner needs 2 specific cards to get to the to successfully run the remote, well, Joule will stop that because you can pick those 2 options and the runner has to forego one of them. In this case, it was always the Film Critic that they ditched. But in this particular game, we saw that even with the double gear check, my opponent was still able to steal the Obokata later on, and that's because Joule After the double gear check, my opponent simply reset, jacked out of the server, and set up again. This time, they negated the double gear check. They worked their way around it by, ensuring that they could steal the Obo Carter even without Film Critic installed. You notice that the next turn they simply drew up to 4 cards in hand and then ran the server again. I picked Paperclip and something, it wasn't relevant, they just, kept the Paperclip on the table and stole my Obo Carter right in front of my face without a Sentry Breaker. So this just goes to show you that firstly, double gear check is incredibly hard to pull off. I got lucky this game that in the sense that my opponent gave me the opportunity to double gear check them once, but they just had to reset and go in again, and I could only single gear check them with the single Seder Adaptive Barrier. My innermost ice wasn't the end the run sentry code gate that I was looking for. Something like Enigma would have stopped them dead in their tracks, but I didn't have that. It is very difficult to pull off the perfect remote server of Joule into Vanilla into Enigma, for example. Having a barrier and a code gate both behind a Joule. So Joule is so much more positional than most other positional ice, making it really, really difficult to use. So yeah, because of this, the ideal remote server I was thinking of, something like a Joule into Vanilla. I thought this would have been a solid server to rush agendas behind, push an Obo Carter through this server turn 2 or turn 3, and the runner has very few answers. But nope, that's not the case. It's very easy for the runner to simply get through and install their Paperclip. Or rather, they can just have their Paperclip installed already, and you cannot get rid of it using Joule because you have to pick another card to go with the Paperclip, and they'll always make sure that the Paperclip or whatever barrier breaker stays on the board. This is a very big weakness of Joule, and because of this, the hype I once had for Joule is now all but nothing. It is a lot worse than I initially thought it was, because it simply doesn't force your opponent to install their Sentry Breaker at all. That being said, it's not the worst ice in the world, it still has a niche. As I mentioned at the start of this video, it's still really good against the Anarch Conspiracy Breakers. If they don't have the foresight to pre-install their Paperclip or their Black Orchestra, or if they are in the bin because of inject, for example, well, they're stuck. They're shut out, and they're out of luck because they have no way to install it from the bin without first encountering the ice. And when they do encounter the Vanilla, for example, it's behind the Joule, and that means that they cannot install cards for the rest of the turn. So it's good against Anarchs, but unless your meta is full of Anarchs, I wouldn't rely on Joule doing its job. Against Shapers and Criminals, I think it is very lackluster. As a piece of ice, I'd be better off in this game having a Sapper instead to trash my opponent's Paperclip outright and force them to actually repay the 4 credits to reinstall the Paperclip. That would have been a much more significant tempo hit in my opinion. So yep, that's about it. Thanks for watching and happy net running. Hope you enjoyed this Joule video. See you next time. Ciao.